The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, sending crystal shards across my childhood bedroom like fallen stars. My hands trembled as I stared at the bank statement that had arrived in yesterday's mail, the numbers blurring through tears I refused to let fall. Zero balance. After 28 years of careful management and compound interest, my grandmother's trust fund had been completely drained. Not for my education, not for my wedding, not for my future children. For Tyler's third failed restaurant venture and his mounting gambling debts that my parents couldn't bear to see him face alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was standing in the same room where Grandma Rose had whispered her final promise to me 12 years ago. This money is for you, Natalie, not your parents, not your brother, you. Promise me you'll use it to build something beautiful. I had promised, believing that the legal documents and trust structures would protect her final gift to me. I had underestimated the lengths to which Robert and Linda Brooks would go to save their golden child from the consequences of his own choices. The Connecticut autumn had painted the Brooks family estate in shades of amber and crimson, the same colors that now seemed to reflect the rage burning in my chest. I had driven up from Portland specifically for this confrontation, the bank documents clutched in my passenger seat like evidence of a crime. Because that's exactly what this was, even if the law might disagree. My parents had used their positions as co-trustees to systematically drain an account that was meant to secure my future, funneling every penny into Tyler's endless stream of failures. The massive colonial house looked exactly as it had during my childhood, all perfectly manicured hedges and imported stonework that screamed old money respectability. What a joke that had turned out to be. I parked my modest Honda Civic next to Tyler's brand new BMW M5, the car he'd somehow managed to afford despite claiming bankruptcy just 6 months earlier. The sight of it made my stomach clench with a familiar mixture of hurt and fury that had defined most of my adult relationship with my family. Linda Brooks answered the front door wearing her standard uniform of Chanel suit and practiced smile, the same outfit she wore to all the charity luncheons where she played the role of devoted philanthropist. Her expression faltered slightly when she saw my face, but she recovered quickly with the social grace that had been drilled into her since birth. Natalie, darling, what a wonderful surprise. We weren't expecting you until Thanksgiving. She moved to embrace me, but I stepped back, holding up the bank statement like a shield between us. Where's Dad? And Tyler? I need to speak with all of you. Something in my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation because Linda's smile finally cracked completely. She led me through the familiar hallways lined with family portraits that told the story of the Brooks legacy, each generation prouder and more prosperous than the last. At least that's how it was supposed to look. The reality was that my parents had been living beyond their means for years, maintaining appearances while their actual finances crumbled beneath the weight of poor investments and Tyler's constant financial emergencies. Robert Brooks was in his study, the same mahogany-paneled room where he'd taught me to play chess and helped me with calculus homework before everything changed. Before Tyler's addiction issues became the family's singular focus, consuming every conversation and every dollar until there was nothing left for anyone else. Dad looked up from his laptop with the same distracted expression he'd worn for the past decade, the look of a man perpetually solving problems that never stayed solved. Natalie, honey, your mother said you seemed upset about something. His tone was already defensive, the way it always got when he sensed criticism coming. Tyler lounged in one of the leather armchairs, scrolling through his phone with the casual indifference that had always been his trademark. At 31, he still carried himself like the college quarterback he'd been, all broad shoulders and easy charm that had been getting him out of trouble his entire life. I placed the bank statement on Dad's desk, watching his face carefully as he picked it up and scanned the numbers. The color drained from his cheeks, but his jaw set in the stubborn line I remembered from every argument we'd had about Tyler's behavior over the years. I can explain, he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. $850,000, Dad. That's what Grandma Rose left me. 8 years of compound interest should have brought it close to $1.2 million by now. Instead, I'm looking at a balance of $0.37. My voice was remarkably steady considering the earthquake happening in my chest. I want to know exactly where every penny went, and I want to know now. Tyler finally looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from boredom to something that might have been shame if I didn't know him better. Nat, come on, don't be so dramatic. It's not like you needed the money anyway. You've got that little business thing going on in Portland. That little business thing. 3 years of 16-hour days building a digital marketing consultancy from nothing, sleeping on friends' couches and eating ramen for every meal until I finally started landing clients who could pay real money. That little business thing that now employed 12 people and generated over $2 million in annual revenue. That little business thing that I'd built entirely without family money because I'd wanted to prove I could succeed on my own merits before touching Grandma's gift. That little business thing has nothing to do with the fact that you stole from me. I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. That money wasn't a family emergency fund. It wasn't Dad's retirement account. It was specifically designated for me, with clear legal parameters about how it could be used. Linda jumped in with the same soothing tone she'd used when Tyler got arrested for his second DUI. Sweetie, we didn't steal anything. We're co-trustees, which means we have fiduciary responsibility to make decisions in your best interest. Tyler was in real trouble, and family comes first. You understand that, don't you? The sheer audacity of it left me speechless for a moment. They had reframed theft as family loyalty, as if draining my inheritance to fund Tyler's gambling addiction was somehow an act of love. I looked around the room at these three people who shared my DNA, but felt like strangers, wondering when exactly I had become the outsider in my own family. Tyler's restaurant failed because he was using the till money to place bets, I said flatly. The second restaurant failed because he was stealing from the register to pay back his bookie. Now you're telling me that the third restaurant, the one that failed 6 months ago, was funded entirely with my inheritance. Tyler's face flushed red, but instead of shame, I saw anger. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, Nat. Dad's business has been struggling, Mom's had medical bills, and I was trying to create something that could support all of us. I was trying to be responsible. Responsible. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Tyler, who had never held a job for longer than 18 months, who had crashed 3 cars and lost 2 apartments to eviction, who had borrowed money from every friend and family member multiple times over, was lecturing me about responsibility. Where's the deed to this house? I asked suddenly, a terrible suspicion forming in my mind. The silence that followed was answer enough. Dad's face went from defensive to defeated in the span of a heartbeat, and I knew that the worst was yet to come. Natalie, he said carefully, the real estate market has been challenging, and we had some cash flow issues with the business. We took out a second mortgage to help Tyler get back on his feet, and when that wasn't enough, we had to leverage the house for a bridge loan. The room started spinning. Not only had they stolen my inheritance, but they had also gambled away the family home that had been in our family for 3 generations. The house where Grandma Rose had lived her final years, where she'd told me stories about building a life of independence and dignity. The house where I'd planned to bring my own children someday to hear those same stories. How much do you owe? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The total debt service is about $8,000 a month, Dad admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Between the original mortgage, the second mortgage and the bridge loan, we're carrying about $1.4 million in total debt on a house that's worth maybe $1 million in today's market. They were underwater by $300,000, bleeding $8,000 a month, and their solution had been to steal money from their daughter's trust fund to keep the sinking ship afloat a little longer. The mathematical impossibility of their situation was staggering, but what hurt most was the realization that they had never even considered asking for my help. They had simply taken what they believed belonged to them by virtue of being my parents. I've been sending you updates about my business for 3 years, I said, looking directly at Dad. I've told you about the clients we've landed, the revenue growth, the expansion plans. Did it never occur to you that maybe, just maybe, your daughter who built a multi-million-dollar company from scratch might be able to help you restructure your debt legally and ethically? Linda's perfectly applied makeup was starting to run as tears mixed with mascara. We didn't want to burden you with our problems, sweetheart. You seemed so happy and independent in Portland. We thought we could handle it ourselves. Handle it themselves by committing what amounted to financial fraud against their own daughter. The twisted logic of it was breathtaking. They would rather steal from me than admit they needed help, would rather risk destroying our relationship permanently than face the temporary embarrassment of asking for assistance from the child they had always seen as the lesser sibling. Tyler stood up suddenly, his charm finally giving way to the entitled rage that had always lurked beneath the surface. You know what, Nat? Fine, you want to throw a tantrum about money, go ahead. But don't act like you're some kind of victim here. You got out. You got to leave all the family drama behind and build your perfect little life 3,000 miles away, while the rest of us dealt with real problems. Real problems. As if my problems had never been real because I'd had the audacity to solve them without depending on family money or family connections. As if the 70-hour weeks and missed meals and sleepless nights I'd invested in building something from nothing were somehow less valid than his endless cycle of failure and bailouts. You want to know about real problems, Tyler? I stood up to face him, suddenly feeling every ounce of resentment I'd been suppressing for years. Real problems are working 3 jobs to pay for community college because your parents spent your college fund bailing out your brother's first business failure. Real problems are building a company without any safety net because your inheritance was secretly being used to subsidize someone else's gambling addiction. Real problems are discovering that your own family sees you as nothing more than a backup plan when their golden child inevitably disappoints them again. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment I thought Tyler might actually take a swing at me. Instead, he grabbed his car keys from the side table and headed for the door. "I don't have to listen to this," he said over his shoulder.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"When you're ready to act like family instead of some corporate robot, let me know." The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving me alone with my parents and the wreckage of 3 decades of dysfunctional family dynamics. Dad slumped back in his chair like a man who'd aged 10 years in the past hour, while Mom perched on the edge of the sofa, twisting her wedding ring around her finger in the nervous gesture I remembered from childhood. "Natalie," Dad said finally. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. We made mistakes, serious ones. But we're still your family, and we love you. We can figure out a way to make this right. Make it right." After stealing nearly $1 million and lying about it for months, they thought there was some simple way to make it right. The naivety of it would have been endearing if it weren't so insulting. "The trust fund is gone," I said flatly. "Even if you could pay it back, which we both know you can't, the compound interest alone represents years of growth that can never be recovered. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that you did all of this without ever considering that I might have been willing to help if you'd just been honest with me." Linda looked up with something that might have been hope. "Does that mean you'll help us now? With the house payments, I mean. We know you're doing well with your business." The question hit me like a physical blow. Even now, even after everything that had been revealed, their first instinct was to see me as a solution to their financial problems rather than a daughter they had betrayed. They weren't asking for forgiveness or offering to make amends. They were asking for more money. I picked up my purse and headed for the door, my mind already racing through the implications of what I'd learned and what I was going to do about it. I need some time to process all of this. I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown tonight. "Natalie, wait," Dad called after me. "Don't leave like this. We can talk through it, work out a payment plan, something." I paused at the doorway of the study, looking back at the 2 people who had raised me but never really understood me. "You want to work out a payment plan? Here's my plan. I'm going to do exactly what you did to me. I'm going to make financial decisions that I believe are in everyone's best interest, without consulting you first, and regardless of how you feel about it." The drive back to my hotel was a blur of autumn colors and racing thoughts. By the time I reached my room, I had already started formulating a plan that would teach my family the same lesson they had unknowingly taught me, that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences arrive with interest. The hotel room felt like a sanctuary after the emotional battlefield of my childhood home. I sat cross-legged on the king-sized bed, my laptop open and 3 different phones charging on the nightstand. The view from the 15th floor overlooked downtown Riverside, where the old money families had built their empires on the backs of steel mills and railroad fortunes. How fitting that I was looking down on it all now, literally and figuratively. My hands moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as I logged into accounts and systems that my parents had no idea existed. Brooks Digital Solutions was just the public face of what I'd built over the past 5 years. Behind the scenes, I had quietly assembled a portfolio of investments, real estate holdings, and business interests that would have shocked anyone who still saw me as Robert and Linda's overlooked daughter. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Tyler was burning through my inheritance, I had been building an empire that dwarfed anything our family had ever achieved. The difference was that I had done it through careful planning, strategic partnerships, and an understanding of market dynamics that came from actually paying attention instead of expecting handouts. My first call was to Marcus Rivera, my business partner and the closest thing I had to family outside of the DNA lottery that had saddled me with the Brooks name. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had gotten me through some of the darkest moments of building our company. Nat, how did the family visit go? Please tell me your brother didn't ask for another loan. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Worse, much worse. They didn't ask for a loan because they already took one. From my trust fund. All of it. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Marcus found his voice. What do you mean all of it? The money your grandmother left you. $850,000, plus whatever growth it should have seen over the past 8 years. Gone, used to fund Tyler's third restaurant failure and cover the mounting debt on the family house. I could hear Marcus typing in the background, probably pulling up financial records and legal documents the way he always did when we faced a crisis. Nat, that's not just theft, that's a massive breach of fiduciary duty. Co-trustee or not, they can't just drain a trust for their own benefit. We can sue them into the ground. I know we can, but lawsuits take years, and frankly you can't get blood from a stone. They're already leveraged to the hilt. The house is underwater, Dad's business is failing, and Tyler owes money to people who don't accept payment plans. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the evening traffic move through the streets like blood cells through arteries. But I have a better idea. Marcus knew me well enough to recognize the tone in my voice. We'd been through enough battles together, fought enough competitors who underestimated us, won enough contracts that seemed impossible. What are you thinking? Remember the Hartwell Group acquisition we've been discussing? The one where we couldn't quite make the numbers work because of the cash flow requirements. I was already pulling up the files on my laptop, cross-referencing market analyses and financial projections that I'd been working on for months. The debt collection agency. Nat, that's a completely different industry from digital marketing. The regulatory environment alone would be a nightmare to navigate. Different industry, same skill set. Data analysis, customer relationship management, strategic communication, process optimization. Plus, I've been researching the space for 6 months. There's a huge opportunity in ethical debt recovery, especially for medical and educational debt. My fingers were flying across the keyboard now, updating spreadsheets and recalculating projections based on new variables. Marcus was quiet for a moment, probably running his own calculations. You want to buy a debt collection agency to go after your own parents. I want to buy a debt collection agency because it's a smart business move that will diversify our portfolio and generate significant returns. The fact that it might also give me some leverage with my family's creditors is just a happy coincidence. Natalie. Marcus's voice carried a warning tone that I'd learned to recognize over the years. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be.
But don't let emotion drive business decisions. That's not who you are. He was right, of course. One of the things that had made our partnership so successful was my ability to separate personal feelings from strategic thinking. But this wasn't just about emotion. This was about justice. And sometimes justice required creative solutions. Pull the Hartwell files, I said. Schedule a conference call with their principals for tomorrow morning. And Marcus? Start researching Connecticut foreclosure laws. I want to understand exactly how the process works. Timelines, homeowner protections, everything. You're serious about this? Dead serious. My parents taught me a valuable lesson today about family loyalty and financial responsibility. I think it's time I taught them one back. After I hung up with Marcus, I ordered room service and settled in for a long night of research. The Hartwell Group had been on my radar for months as a potential acquisition target. They specialized in what they called compassionate collections, working primarily with hospitals and universities to recover debts while maintaining ethical standards and regulatory compliance. Their client base was solid, their processes were documented, and their technology infrastructure was surprisingly sophisticated for a company that had been around for 30 years. More importantly, they held contracts with several major medical centers and financial institutions in the Connecticut region, including, I discovered after some careful research, the bank that held my parents' mortgage and the private lending company that had issued their bridge loan. The numbers were starting to make sense in a way that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with smart business. Hartwell Group's annual revenue was about $12 million,
with net margins around 18%. They were looking to sell because the founder wanted to retire, and his children had no interest in taking over the business. The asking price was $7 million, which was reasonable given their client base and market position. What made it especially attractive was their reputation in the industry. Unlike the stereotypical debt collection agencies that relied on aggressive tactics and legal intimidation, Hartwell had built their business on relationship management and creative payment solutions. They worked with debtors to establish realistic payment plans, offered hardship programs, and focused on long-term recovery rates rather than short-term pressure tactics. It was exactly the kind of company that could complement our existing business while opening up entirely new revenue streams. The fact that it would also give me insight into my parents' financial situation was just a bonus. My second call was to Diana Walsh, the attorney who had handled the incorporation of Brooks Digital Solutions and managed most of our legal affairs. Diana had a reputation for being thorough, discreet, and utterly ruthless when the situation called for it. She was exactly what I needed right now. Diana, it's Natalie. I need you to research an acquisition target and handle some family legal issues. Probably going to be a complicated situation. How complicated are we talking? Corporate litigation, regulatory issues, or family drama? All of the above, potentially. I'm looking at acquiring a debt collection agency, which means regulatory compliance review, due diligence on their client contracts, and assessment of their legal exposure. But there's also a personal element involving breach of fiduciary duty and possible fraud. Diana's interest was audible through the phone. Someone stole from you. My parents emptied my trust fund to cover my brother's gambling debts. They were co-trustees, so it may not technically be theft, but it's definitely a breach of their fiduciary responsibilities. I could hear Diana typing notes, probably already formulating legal strategies and potential remedies. How much money are we talking about? About $1-2 million including projected growth. But Diana, I don't want to sue them. I want to buy their debt. The typing stopped. Come again? They're in default on multiple loans totaling about $1-4 million. House is underwater, business is failing, and they're bleeding cash every month. I want to acquire the company that services their debt, then restructure their obligations in a way that teaches them some valuable lessons about financial responsibility. Natalie, I need to be very clear about something. What you're describing could be seen as predatory lending or abuse of process, depending on how it's structured. There are laws about conflicts of interest in debt collection, especially when there's a family relationship involved. That's why I'm calling you. I want to do this completely legally and ethically. No strong-arm tactics, no harassment, no abuse. I want to offer them exactly the same payment options and hardship programs that the agency offers all their clients. I just want to be the one making those decisions instead of some stranger who doesn't understand the full context. Diana was quiet for several minutes, probably researching regulations and precedents in her head the way she always did when faced with an unusual legal question. It's not impossible, but it would require very careful structuring. We'd need to establish clear policies and procedures, document everything meticulously, and probably involve a third-party mediator to ensure fairness. Whatever it takes, just make sure we do it right. I'll need a few days to research the regulatory requirements and draft a preliminary structure. In the meantime, don't contact your parents about any of this. If they're going to claim undue influence or coercion later, we need to be able to show that you acted entirely through proper business channels. After I hung up with Diana, I spent the rest of the evening diving deeper into Hartwell Group's financials and operational data. Their client retention rate was impressive, averaging over 80% year-over-year renewals. Their recovery rates were consistently above industry standards, which suggested that their compassionate collections approach was actually more effective than traditional aggressive tactics. Most importantly, their employee satisfaction scores were remarkably high for an industry that typically had massive turnover issues. The staff had been with the company for an average of 7 years, which meant they had institutional knowledge and established relationships with both clients and debtors. That kind of human capital was invaluable, and would make the integration much smoother. By midnight I had drafted a preliminary acquisition proposal that Marcus could review in the morning.
The financial structure was straightforward. We would acquire Hartwell Group through a combination of cash and debt financing, maintain their existing management structure, and integrate their operations with our existing technology platforms to improve efficiency and reduce costs. The projected returns were solid even without considering the personal benefits. Within 3 years, we should be able to double their revenue through improved technology, expanded service offerings, and strategic partnerships with our existing clients. Many of the hospitals and universities that used our digital marketing services could also benefit from their debt recovery expertise. As I finally closed my laptop and prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a text message from Tyler. "Mom's been crying for 2 hours. Dad locked himself in his study. Hope you're happy." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'm not happy, Tyler. I'm disappointed. There's a difference." His reply came back immediately. "Whatever, you always were a cold bitch." I turned off my phone without responding. Some people never learned that actions had consequences, no matter how many times life tried to teach them. But I was about to provide a masterclass in cause and effect that would be impossible to ignore. The next morning I was up at 6, reviewing market reports and finalizing my notes for the Hartwell Group conference call. Marcus called at 7:30, his voice carrying the excitement that always accompanied a new business opportunity. "I've been up all night running numbers on the Hartwell acquisition," he said without preamble. "Nat, this is brilliant. Not just from a personal standpoint but from a pure business perspective. Their client base is completely complementary to ours, their profit margins are higher than our core business, and the market opportunity in ethical debt recovery is massive. I was hoping you'd see it that way. What about the regulatory concerns?" I talked to my cousin Elena, the one who works in financial services compliance. She says as long as we maintain arm's-length transactions and follow standard industry practices, there shouldn't be any issues with the family connection. The key is documenting everything and treating your parents exactly the same as any other debtor. The conference call with Hartwell Group went better than I had expected. Richard Hartwell, the founder, was a thoughtful man in his early 70s who had built his company on principles that aligned perfectly with my own values. He was tired of dealing with the day-to-day operations, but genuinely cared about preserving the company culture he had created. "Miss Brooks," he said during our video call, "I've done some research on your company since we scheduled this meeting. I'm impressed by what you've built, but I have to ask why you're interested in acquiring a debt collection agency. It's not exactly adjacent to digital marketing." "Mr. Hartwell, I believe that business is fundamentally about solving problems for people, whether that's helping them reach new customers or helping them resolve financial obligations. Your company has built a reputation for treating people with dignity while achieving excellent results. That's exactly the kind of culture I want to be associated with." Richard smiled, and I could see that he was beginning to understand that I wasn't just another corporate buyer looking to strip assets and cut costs. "What would you do with our existing staff?" "Keep them all, at least initially. Your people are your greatest asset, and their relationships with clients and debtors are irreplaceable. I'd want to invest in additional training and technology to make them even more effective, but the core team would remain intact." "And the company policies?" "Our approach to working with people who are struggling financially. I wouldn't change a thing. If anything, I'd want to expand your hardship programs and develop new tools to help people get back on their feet. There's a huge opportunity in the market for ethical debt recovery, and I think we could be leaders in that space." By the end of the call, we had agreed on a preliminary valuation of $6.8 million and a timeline for due diligence that would have us closing the transaction within 60 days. Richard seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of his company continuing under leadership that shared his values. As soon as the call ended, I dialed Diana's number. "The Hartwell acquisition is moving forward. I need you to expedite the regulatory research and start drafting the purchase documents." "Already on it. I've been in touch with the Connecticut Department of Banking and the Federal Trade Commission to make sure we understand all the compliance requirements. The good news is that there's nothing preventing you from acquiring your parents' debt as long as you follow standard collection practices." "What about the conflict of interest issues?" "We'll need to establish a Chinese wall between your personal knowledge of their financial situation and the company's debt collection activities. Essentially, you'll need to recuse yourself from any direct involvement in their case, and let your employees handle it according to standard procedures. That works for me. I don't want any special treatment for them anyway. They made their choices, and now they get to live with the consequences like everyone else. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal documents, financial audits, and regulatory filings. The due diligence process revealed that Hartwell Group was even more valuable than the initial numbers had suggested. Their client contracts were solid, their technology systems were well maintained, and their compliance record was spotless. More importantly, their staff was genuinely excited about the acquisition once they understood our plans for expansion and growth. Several of them had innovative ideas for improving their processes that we incorporated into our integration planning. During this time, my parents called repeatedly, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails asking me to return their calls. Tyler sent a series of text messages that progressed from angry to pleading to angry again. I ignored them all, focusing instead on building something that would secure my financial future in a way that no trust fund ever could. The acquisition closed on a Thursday morning in November. I was now the majority owner of a debt collection agency that held the paper on my parents' house, their business loans, and Tyler's personal guarantees on his failed restaurant ventures. The total amount owed was $1.47 million, which coincidentally was almost exactly what they had stolen from my trust fund when you factored in the projected growth and compound interest. That afternoon, I received a call from my new head of operations, a competent woman named Sarah Chen, who had been with Hartwell Group for 12 years. "Miss Brooks, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. We've got a client meeting scheduled for Monday with some debtors who are in pretty serious default. The Brooks family in Riverside. I know that's your last name, so I wanted to make sure there wasn't any conflict of interest." I smiled even though she couldn't see it through the phone. "No conflict at all, Sarah. Please handle their case according to standard company procedures. I'm sure you'll find an equitable solution that works for everyone involved." Absolutely, we pride ourselves on working with people to find sustainable payment plans. The Brooks family owes about $1.47 million across multiple loans, but will structure something reasonable based on their ability to pay. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my parents were about to learn the same lesson I had spent the past month learning. Sometimes the most important education comes from unexpected sources, and sometimes the teacher is someone you never thought would have anything to teach you. The difference was that when I learned my lesson, I used it to build something better. Soon we'd find out what my parents were capable of learning, and what they were prepared to build with that knowledge. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made everything seem sharper, more defined. I sat in my newly acquired conference room at Hartwell Group's headquarters, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as my parents' BMW pulled into the visitor parking lot. They were 15 minutes early for their appointment, which told me everything I needed to know about their current state of mind. Robert and Linda Brooks had never been early for anything in their lives unless they were desperate. Sarah Chen knocked on my door frame, holding a thick manila folder that contained 3 years of payment history, default notices, and correspondence related to the Brooks family debt portfolio. She had no idea she was about to conduct the most important meeting of my professional life, and I intended to keep it that way. "The Brooks family is here for their 10 o'clock appointment," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I've reviewed their entire file, and honestly, it's a mess. Multiple loans, cross-collateralized assets, personal guarantees that exceed the underlying collateral value. They're what we'd typically classify as a high-risk restructure case." I nodded, keeping my expression professionally neutral while my heart hammered against my rib cage. "What's your initial assessment for resolution?" "Well, the good news is that they've been making partial payments, so they're not completely unresponsive. The bad news is that their current payment plan would take them about 47 years to satisfy the debt, and that's assuming no additional interest or fees. They need a complete restructure, or they're looking at foreclosure within the next 6 months." Sarah spread the documents across the conference table, and I found myself staring at the financial autopsy of my family's decline. Credit reports showing a steady deterioration over the past 5 years. Bank statements revealing the systematic transfer of funds from my trust account to cover mounting losses. Loan applications where Tyler had inflated his income by nearly 300%, and my parents had co-signed based on assets they'd already secretly pledged elsewhere. "Have you identified what triggered their current financial crisis?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Multiple factors, but it looks like the primary issue was a series of failed business ventures by their son Tyler Brooks. Restaurant investments, some kind of consulting business that never got off the ground, and what appears to be significant gambling losses based on some of the withdrawal patterns we see in their banking history. Sarah pulled out a timeline she'd constructed showing the correlation between Tyler's various failures and the increasing desperation in my parents' borrowing patterns. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, each decision making the next crisis inevitable. The interesting thing is that they had significant liquid assets, as recently as 18 months ago. There was a trust account with over $800,000 that they liquidated completely. If they'd used that money to pay down their existing debt, instead of funding new ventures, they'd probably be in a manageable position right now. My throat tightened as I stared at the documentation of my stolen inheritance being funneled into Tyler's bottomless pit of poor decisions. Seeing it laid out in black and white, with professional analysis of how differently things could have gone, made the betrayal feel fresh all over again. What's your recommendation for moving forward? Sarah leaned back in her chair, the way she always did when she was about to deliver difficult news to a client. Honestly, Miss Brooks, this family needs a reality check. They've been living in denial about their financial situation for years, making increasingly desperate decisions that only made things worse. Any sustainable solution is going to require them to face some hard truths about their spending habits and their son's addiction issues. And if they're not willing to face those truths, then we'll have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure and asset seizure. The house will probably sell for enough to cover most of what they owe, but they'll be left with nothing, and their credit will be destroyed for the next decade. I stood up and walked to the window, watching my parents sit in their car in the parking lot below. Dad was gesturing emphatically, while Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. They were probably rehearsing their presentation, figuring out how to charm or manipulate their way into a better payment plan. It was the same dynamic I'd watched play out hundreds of times during Tyler's various crises. I want you to handle this case personally, Sarah. Don't delegate it to any of the junior associates. And I want you to offer them every option in our standard hardship program, but make sure they understand that this is their last chance to resolve this voluntarily. Of course. Should I schedule a follow-up meeting, or wait to see how they respond to the initial proposal?
Schedule the follow-up for 2 weeks from today. That should give them enough time to digest the reality of their situation and hopefully make some rational decisions. Sarah gathered her files and headed for the door, then paused. You know, it's funny. I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I can usually predict how people are going to react to financial pressure. But this Brooks family is hard to read. The parents seemed genuinely shocked by how bad their situation has gotten, like they honestly didn't understand what was happening to their finances. Some people are very good at ignoring problems until they become crises, I said carefully. Hopefully they'll be better at solving problems than they were at preventing them. As Sarah left for the conference room, I moved to the observation area that Richard Hartwell had installed years ago. It was a small alcove behind one-way glass that allowed management to observe sensitive client meetings for training and quality control purposes. I'd never planned to use it for personal reasons, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to watch my parents finally confront the consequences of their actions. Robert and Linda entered the conference room with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're in serious trouble, but still hoping someone else will fix it for you. Dad wore his best suit, the navy pinstripe that he usually reserved for important client meetings. Mom had clearly spent extra time on her makeup, probably trying to hide the evidence of sleepless nights and stress-induced aging. Sarah began with her standard introduction, explaining Hartwell Group's philosophy of collaborative debt resolution and outlining the various options available to help families regain financial stability. My parents nodded along politely, but I could see Dad's jaw getting tighter as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, Sarah said, opening the file folder, I've conducted a comprehensive analysis of your financial obligations, and I need to be frank with you about where things stand. Your total debt service across all loans is currently $1.47 million. Your documented income is approximately $98,000 annually. Even with the most generous restructuring terms we can offer, you're looking at monthly payments that exceed your take-home pay. Mom's hand went to her throat in the gesture I remembered from childhood, the one she made when she was trying not to panic. Dad leaned forward in his chair, shifting into the aggressive negotiation mode that had probably worked for him in business, but was completely inappropriate for this situation. Look, we understand that the numbers look challenging on paper, Dad said, but you have to understand that we've had some unusual expenses recently. Family emergencies, medical bills, that sort of thing. Our son went through a difficult period, and we felt obligated to help him get back on his feet. Sarah nodded sympathetically while making notes on her legal pad. I can see from your payment history that there have been some irregular large expenditures. Can you help me understand what those were for? Tyler, our son, he's an entrepreneur, very talented, very ambitious. He had some ventures that didn't work out the way he expected, and we helped him with bridge financing until he could get back on track. The way Dad described Tyler's gambling addiction and serial business failures as temporary setbacks requiring bridge financing was almost artistic in its delusion. Even now, facing financial ruin, he couldn't admit that his golden child was fundamentally irresponsible with money. I see. And is Tyler in a position now to help contribute to the debt resolution, given that some of the obligations were incurred on his behalf? Mom and Dad exchanged a look that told Sarah everything she needed to know. Tyler wasn't contributing anything except additional problems. Tyler is focused on building his next venture right now, Mom said carefully. We wouldn't want to burden him with our financial issues while he's trying to establish himself professionally. Sarah's pen stopped moving. In 12 years of debt collection, she'd heard every excuse and rationalization imaginable, but the idea of parents protecting their adult son from the consequences of debts incurred on his behalf was apparently a new one. Mrs. Brooks, I need to be very clear about something. The personal guarantees that you and your husband signed make you fully liable for Tyler's business debts regardless of his current financial situation. From a legal standpoint, this isn't your debt helping him, this is your debt, period. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years of denial finally colliding with immutable legal reality. Dad's face was turning red, the way it always did when someone challenged his version of events. Mom was twisting her wedding ring again, probably calculating how much it might be worth if they had to pawn it. What are our options? Dad finally asked. Sarah pulled out a printed document and slid it across the table. We can offer you a structured payment plan over 15 years at 6% interest. That would bring your monthly payment down to about $8,700, which is still above your current documented income but might be manageable if you're willing to make some lifestyle adjustments. $8,700 a month, Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. That's more than we bring home after taxes. I understand that it seems overwhelming, but you have to remember that you're currently carrying debt that was structured for much shorter terms. We're essentially giving you 15 years to pay off obligations that are technically due now. Dad was studying the payment schedule with the kind of desperate attention that people usually reserved for lottery tickets. What if we sold the house? What would that do to the numbers? Well, based on current market conditions and the outstanding liens against the property, you'd probably net about $200,000 from a sale after paying off the mortgages and bridge loans. That would reduce your payment to about $6,500 a month, which is still above your documented income. The math was brutal and inescapable. Even if they gave up the family home that had been in our family for 3 generations, they still couldn't afford the payments on the debt they'd accumulated trying to save Tyler from his own mistakes. There has to be another option, Dad said. Some kind of hardship program, or debt forgiveness, or something. Sarah's expression softened slightly. This was the moment in every case where people realized that their financial problems couldn't be solved with clever negotiation or emotional appeals. Brooks, we do have hardship programs, but they require full financial disclosure and verification of income and expenses. You'd need to provide 3 years of tax returns, bank statements, credit card statements, and documentation of all assets and liabilities. We can do that, Mom said quickly, probably thinking that more paperwork would somehow change the fundamental mathematics of their situation. The other requirement for our hardship program is that all family members who benefited from the borrowed funds must participate in the resolution. That would include Tyler, since the majority of your debt was incurred to fund his various business ventures. Dad's face went from red to purple. That's completely unreasonable. You can't force our son to participate in something that's not his legal obligation. You're absolutely right, Mr. Brooks, we can't force Tyler to participate. But we also can't approve a hardship program that doesn't address the root cause of the financial crisis. If Tyler continues to create financial emergencies that you feel obligated to solve, then any payment plan we create will eventually fail. I watched my parents grapple with a truth they'd been avoiding for years. Tyler's problems weren't temporary setbacks that could be fixed with enough money and patience. They were patterns of behavior that would continue as long as someone else was willing to pay the price for his mistakes. What happens if we can't agree to any of these payment plans? Mom asked quietly. Sarah's voice remained professional but carried an unmistakable note of finality. Then we would have no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings on the house and pursue collection on all other collateralized assets. The process takes about 90 days in Connecticut, after which the properties would be sold at auction. And then what? We'd be homeless. You'd be responsible for any deficiency remaining after the asset sales, but your other income sources would be protected under Connecticut's exemption laws. Social Security, pension payments, that sort of thing. My parents sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that their 30 years of financial maneuvering had led them to a dead end with no clever escape routes. Dad was staring at the payment schedule like he could change the numbers through sheer force of will. Mom was crying quietly, probably thinking about having to tell her country club friends that they'd lost the family home. Can we have some time to think about this? Dad asked eventually. Of course, I'll schedule a follow-up meeting for 2 weeks from today. That will give you time to discuss options with your family and gather any financial documentation you'd like us to consider. As my parents gathered their coats and prepared to leave, Sarah handed them a business card and a folder containing information about credit counseling services and financial planning resources. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, I want you to know that we're here to help you find a sustainable solution. But that's only possible if everyone involved is willing to be honest about how you got into this situation and what it's going to take to get out of it. After they left, Sarah returned to my office with a thoughtful expression. That was interesting. They're not the usual deadbeat debtors we typically work with. They seem like decent people who made some very poor decisions trying to help their son. What's your professional assessment of their likelihood of successfully completing a payment plan? Sarah sat down and flipped through her notes from the meeting. Honestly, not great. They're still in denial about Tyler's role in creating this mess, and until they're willing to address that, they're just going to keep repeating the same patterns. I've seen it dozens of times with families who have addiction issues. The enabling behavior usually continues until the enablers run out of resources to enable with. And if they don't choose one of the voluntary payment plans, then we'll proceed with foreclosure. The house will probably sell for enough to cover most of what they owe, but they'll lose everything they've built over the past 30 years. It's tragic, really, but sometimes that's what it takes to break the cycle. I nodded, thinking about the irony of the situation. My parents had stolen my inheritance to prevent Tyler from facing the consequences of his actions, and now they were facing consequences that were exponentially worse than anything Tyler would have experienced if they'd simply let him fail on his own. Sarah, I want you to document everything about this case meticulously. Every conversation, every offer we make, every response they give. If this goes to foreclosure, I want our file to be absolutely bulletproof. Of course, is there something specific you're concerned about? Just being thorough. This kind of case can get emotional, and people sometimes make accusations about unfair treatment or predatory practices when they're desperate. I want to make sure we're following every regulation and industry best practice. That evening, I drove past my childhood home on my way back to the hotel. The Christmas lights were up, the same elaborate display that Mom had been perfecting for 20 years. The house looked exactly the way it always had during the holidays, warm and welcoming and expensive. But I knew that behind those twinkling lights, my parents were probably sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills, finally doing the math they'd been avoiding for years. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. I don't know what game you're playing, but Mom and Dad are falling apart. This needs to stop. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. This stops when you start taking responsibility for the consequences of your actions instead of expecting other people to clean up your messes. His response came immediately. Easy for you to say. You ran off to Portland and left the rest of us to deal with real life. Real life is what I've been dealing with while you've been playing house with other people's money. But don't worry, Tyler, you're about to get a master class in reality that you'll never forget. I turned off my phone and drove back to the hotel, already planning the next phase of my parents' education in financial responsibility. Tomorrow I would call Marcus and have him start researching bankruptcy law and asset protection strategies. Not because I intended to help my parents avoid their obligations, but because I wanted to understand exactly what options they would have when they finally realized that their current path led nowhere but financial ruin. The difference between Tyler and me had never been intelligence or opportunity.
It had been the willingness to face difficult truths and make hard decisions based on reality instead of wishful thinking. Soon my entire family was going to learn the value of that difference, whether they wanted to or not. The knock on my hotel room door came at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, 2 weeks after my parents' first meeting with Sarah Chen. I knew who it would be before I opened the door. Marcus Rivera stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression he reserved for moments when he thought I was making decisions that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life. "We need to talk," he said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "And before you say anything, I flew out here because some conversations can't happen over the phone." I accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that it was from the little Ethiopian place in Portland that we'd discovered during our first year in business. Marcus had flown 3,000 miles and brought me coffee from home, which meant he was either very worried about me or very excited about something. Given his expression, I was betting on worried. "Let me guess," I said, settling into the armchair by the window. "Diana told you about the bankruptcy filings." "Diana told me that your parents filed Chapter 13 yesterday, listing Hartwell Group as their primary creditor for $1.47 million. She also told me that Tyler is apparently planning to contest the personal guarantees he signed, claiming he was coerced or mentally incapacitated when he agreed to them." I sipped my coffee and watched the late-night traffic move through downtown Riverside. The bankruptcy filing had been inevitable once my parents realized that even the most generous payment plan would require them to fundamentally restructure their lives. What surprised me was how long it had taken them to accept reality. "Tyler's going to have a hard time proving mental incapacitation," I said. Diana pulled the surveillance footage from the bank, where he signed the guarantee documents. "He was stone-cold sober, asked detailed questions about the terms, and even negotiated for a lower personal liability cap. Hard to claim you didn't understand what you were signing when there's video evidence of you trying to reduce your exposure." Marcus set down his coffee and leaned forward in his chair. "Nat, I need you to listen to me carefully. I've been your business partner for 5 years, and I've never seen you make a decision based purely on emotion. But this situation with your family has pushed you into territory that could destroy everything we've built. How do you figure that? Because you're not thinking like a businesswoman anymore. You're thinking like a daughter who got hurt by her parents, and that's clouding your judgment about the potential consequences of what you're doing." I felt a flash of irritation at Marcus's assessment, but I forced myself to consider his perspective. He'd been watching me navigate this situation from 3,000 miles away, seeing only the financial transactions and legal maneuvering, without the emotional context that drove every decision. "What exactly do you think I'm doing wrong?" "I think you're underestimating how this is going to look to the outside world when the full story comes out. And it will come out, Nat. Tyler's attorney is already floating theories about predatory lending and family exploitation. If this turns into a public relations nightmare, it could damage not just Hartwell Group but our entire business portfolio." Marcus pulled out his tablet and showed me a series of news articles and social media posts that had started appearing over the past week. Someone, probably Tyler, had been talking to journalists about the family's financial crisis and painting a picture of a vindictive daughter who was using her business success to punish her parents for past grievances. The headlines were predictably sensational. "Tech entrepreneur forecloses on parents' home. Family trust becomes family betrayal. When success breeds revenge." The articles were light on facts and heavy on speculation, but they were already generating the kind of negative attention that could follow us for years. "Look at this," Marcus said, scrolling to a particularly inflammatory blog post. "Tyler's been doing interviews, positioning himself as the victim of his sister's corporate manipulation. He's claiming you deliberately targeted your parents' debt as part of some elaborate revenge scheme." I read through the blog post, noting how Tyler had managed to reframe his gambling addiction as entrepreneurial risk-taking, and my parents' theft of my inheritance as family members supporting each other during difficult times. It was masterfully manipulative, painting me as a cold-hearted corporate raider who valued money more than family relationships. "He's good at this," I admitted. "Always has been. Tyler could probably convince people that water flows uphill if it served his purposes. That's exactly my point. He's controlling the narrative right now, and every day that passes makes it harder for us to present the real facts. We need to get ahead of this story before it spirals completely out of control." Marcus was right, of course. I'd been so focused on the legal and financial aspects of the situation that I'd forgotten the most important lesson I'd learned in building Brooks Digital Solutions. Perception often matters more than reality.
especially when you're dealing with complex situations that most people don't understand. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we pivot. Instead of continuing down this path of debt collection and foreclosure, we find a way to resolve this situation that makes you look like the generous daughter who saved her family from financial ruin. I walked to the window and stared down at the street where I'd grown up, thinking about the implications of what Marcus was proposing. You want me to forgive the debt and let them keep the house. I want you to restructure the debt in a way that's sustainable for them, while demonstrating that your acquisition of Hartwell Group was always about legitimate business opportunities, not personal revenge. And what happens to Tyler? He walks away from $1.47 million in obligations without facing any consequences for the decisions that created this mess in the first place. Marcus joined me at the window, his voice carrying the patient tone he used when he was trying to talk me down from decisions he thought were mistakes. Tyler's consequences don't have to be financial, Nat. Sometimes the most effective punishment is forcing someone to live with the knowledge of what they've done and who they really are. Before I could respond, my phone rang.
Diana Walsh's name appeared on the screen, and I could tell from her late-night call that something significant had happened. Nat, we've got a problem, Diana said without preamble. Tyler's attorney filed an emergency motion claiming that Hartwell Group's acquisition was structured specifically to target the Brooks family debt. He's asking for an injunction to prevent any foreclosure proceedings until they can conduct discovery on the acquisition timeline and your motivation for purchasing the company. I closed my eyes and felt the careful legal structure I'd built over the past 2 months beginning to crack under the pressure of Tyler's desperation. How strong is his case? Legally, it's weak. The acquisition was legitimate. Your business justifications are well documented, and there's no evidence of any improper conduct. But from a public relations standpoint, it's devastating. The judge granted a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing next week. What does that mean practically? It means you can't proceed with foreclosure, and it means Tyler's attorney gets to depose you about your motivations and decision-making process. Every email, every phone call, every conversation you've had about this situation becomes potential evidence. After I hung up with Diana, Marcus and I sat in silence for several minutes. The careful strategy I'd developed was unraveling faster than I'd thought possible, and Tyler's public relations campaign was threatening to destroy not just my reputation but the business empire I'd spent years building. There's something else, Marcus said finally. Something I haven't told you yet because I was hoping we could resolve this situation before it became relevant. I looked at him warily. What? Remember the Kellerman Industries contract we've been negotiating? The one that would basically double our annual revenue? Of course. We're supposed to sign final documents next month. James Kellerman called me yesterday. He's concerned about the negative publicity surrounding your family's situation. Specifically, he's worried about associating his company with someone who's being portrayed as vindictive and unethical in business dealings. The news hit me like a physical blow. The Kellerman contract represented 2 years of relationship building and strategic positioning. Losing it wouldn't just cost us money, it would signal to the entire industry that Brooks Digital Solutions was too risky to work with. How concerned is he? Concerned enough to ask for a 60-day cooling-off period while the family situation resolves itself. He didn't say the contract was dead, but he made it clear that any further negative publicity could change his mind about moving forward. I slumped back in my chair, finally understanding the full scope of what Tyler's counterattack could cost me. He couldn't win the legal battle, but he didn't need to. All he had to do was create enough doubt about my character and business practices to make major clients think twice about working with me. You know what the most infuriating part of this is? I said, staring at the ceiling. Tyler's strategy is actually brilliant. He can't defend his actions on the merits, so he's attacking my motivations and making this about family dysfunction instead of financial responsibility. Which is exactly why we need to change the narrative. Marcus said. We need to find a resolution that demonstrates your integrity and business acumen while still holding your family accountable for their actions. I'm listening. Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened a spreadsheet he'd apparently been working on during his flight. What if we restructured their debt through a family business loan instead of traditional debt collection? We create a legitimate business entity, maybe some kind of consulting or property management company, that your parents would run to generate revenue for debt service. You want me to give them a job paying off their own debt. I want you to give them an opportunity to rebuild their lives while taking responsibility for their mistakes. Instead of foreclosure and bankruptcy, they get a chance to work their way out of this situation with dignity intact.
The idea had merit from multiple perspectives. It would demonstrate that my acquisition of Hartwell Group was motivated by legitimate business considerations rather than personal revenge. It would give my parents a path forward that didn't involve losing everything they'd built over 30 years. And most importantly, it would shift the public narrative from corporate raider versus helpless family to successful daughter helping parents recover from financial mistakes. What about Tyler? He's still on the hook for personal guarantees totaling over $800,000. Tyler gets a choice. He can either participate in the family business and work off his obligations, or he can declare personal bankruptcy and deal with the consequences of that decision. But he doesn't get to walk away without facing some kind of accountability. I spent the next hour working through the financial and legal implications of Marcus's proposal. The numbers actually worked reasonably well. If my parents were willing to liquidate their non-essential assets and commit to running a legitimate business operation, they could probably pay off their restructured debt over 10 to 12 years while maintaining a modest but comfortable lifestyle. The key would be structuring the arrangement in a way that genuinely held them accountable while providing enough flexibility to adapt as circumstances changed. They would need to demonstrate consistent revenue generation, maintain detailed financial records, and submit to regular audits to ensure compliance with the payment schedule. There's one condition that's non-negotiable, I said finally. Tyler has to admit publicly that his gambling addiction and business failures created this situation. No more spin, no more victim narrative, no more blaming other people for the consequences of his choices. You think he'll agree to that? I think he'll agree to whatever it takes to avoid personal bankruptcy and the possibility of criminal charges for some of the financial irregularities Diana uncovered in his business records. Marcus grinned for the first time since arriving in Connecticut. You found criminal exposure. Let's just say that Tyler was very creative in how he structured some of his business loans, and creativity in financial documentation sometimes crosses the line into fraud. Diana's still investigating, but there are definitely some transactions that would interest the district attorney if they became public. So Tyler gets a choice between public humiliation and potential prison time. Tyler gets a choice between taking responsibility for his actions and facing the full legal consequences of his decisions. Just like every other adult in the world. The next morning, I called Diana and asked her to draft a comprehensive settlement proposal that would restructure my parents' debt while creating a legitimate business structure for long-term resolution. The proposal would need to satisfy multiple stakeholders. My parents, who needed a viable path forward. Tyler, who needed an alternative to bankruptcy or criminal charges. The court system, which needed evidence that the Hartwell Group acquisition was legitimate, and the business community, which needed reassurance that I operated with integrity and fairness. More importantly, the settlement would need to satisfy my own sense of justice while demonstrating that I valued family relationships more than financial gain. It was a delicate balance, but I was confident that we could structure something that met everyone's needs while establishing clear boundaries and accountability measures. By noon, I had scheduled a family meeting for the following day. Not the kind of hostile confrontation that had characterized our recent interactions, but a genuine business discussion between adults who were ready to solve problems instead of assigning blame. For the first time since discovering my stolen inheritance, I felt like I was operating from a position of strength rather than reacting to other people's poor decisions. Tyler could continue his public relations campaign if he wanted, but it would be much harder to portray me as vindictive when I was offering his family a lifeline instead of pushing them toward financial ruin. The real question was whether my parents and Tyler were ready to accept help that came with strings attached, or whether they would continue to believe that someone else should bear the consequences of their choices. Tomorrow's meeting would answer that question definitively and determine whether this family crisis became an opportunity for growth or a permanent fracture in relationships that had already been damaged by years of enabling and denial. As I prepared for what might be the most important business meeting of my life, I realized that Marcus had been both right and wrong about my motivations. He was right that I'd been thinking like a hurt daughter rather than a dispassionate businesswoman. But he was wrong about the implications of that emotional investment. Sometimes the most important business decisions are the ones that require you to choose between profit and principles, between revenge and redemption. Tomorrow, I would find out what my family was really worth, and whether the lessons I'd learned about building something valuable could be applied to rebuilding something that had been broken. The family meeting took place in the neutral territory of Diana's law office conference room, a space designed for difficult conversations and hard decisions. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Hartford's financial district, where steel and glass towers housed the kind of institutions that had once seemed impossibly powerful to a girl who grew up wearing hand-me-downs and working multiple jobs to pay for textbooks. My parents arrived precisely on time, dressed in their conservative best, and carrying the kind of leather portfolios that suggested they'd spent considerable time preparing for this discussion. Tyler was 10 minutes late, which was actually early for him, and looked like he hadn't slept in days. The past month of legal proceedings and negative publicity had aged him in ways that made his 31 years look closer to 40. Diana had arranged the seating so that I sat at the head of the conference table with Marcus beside me, while my parents and Tyler faced us across an expanse of polished mahogany that might as well have been a chasm. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice carrying the professional tone I'd perfected in hundreds of business meetings. "I asked Diana to schedule this meeting because I believe we've reached a point where continued litigation serves no one's interests. Today, I want to present a comprehensive settlement proposal that addresses everyone's concerns while establishing a sustainable path forward." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably recognizing that the daughter he'd dismissed as financially naive was now controlling a negotiation that would determine his family's future. Mom clutched her purse with white knuckles, the same way she'd gripped the steering wheel during my teenage driving lessons when she was terrified but trying not to show it. Tyler leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, projecting the kind of defiant attitude that had gotten him through every family crisis since childhood. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the recognition that his usual charm and manipulation tactics wouldn't work in a room full of lawyers and financial documents. "Before we discuss settlement terms," Diana interjected, "I need to address the legal realities that have emerged during discovery. Tyler, your attorney's claims about coercion and mental incapacitation have been thoroughly investigated and found to be without merit. The evidence clearly shows that you understood the implications of every document you signed." Diana opened a thick file and removed a series of documents that she spread across the table like playing cards in a high-stakes poker game. Bank records, loan applications, email correspondence, and video surveillance footage from multiple financial institutions where Tyler had signed personal guarantees. "More concerning," Diana continued, "our forensic accounting review has uncovered several transactions that appear to violate federal banking regulations. Specifically, we found evidence of income inflation on loan applications, asset manipulation to qualify for credit lines, and potential wire fraud related to the transfer of trust fund assets." The color drained from Tyler's face as he realized that his attempt to portray himself as a victim had triggered an investigation that revealed far more serious legal exposure than anyone had anticipated. What started as a family financial dispute had evolved into potential criminal liability that could result in federal charges and prison time. "However," I said, drawing everyone's attention back to me, "I didn't ask for this meeting to discuss criminal charges or threaten anyone with prosecution. I asked for this meeting because I believe there's a better solution than destroying this family through continued legal warfare." I pulled out my own folder and removed a bound document that represented weeks of careful planning and strategic thinking. "This is a comprehensive settlement proposal that restructures the family's debt obligations, while creating a legitimate business framework for long-term resolution." Marcus activated the presentation screen and displayed a flowchart showing the proposed business structure. Brooks Family Properties would be established as a limited liability company specializing in property management and real estate consulting. Robert and Linda would serve as managing partners, drawing modest salaries while dedicating profits to debt service. The restructured debt would total $1.2 million over 12 years at 4% interest, I continued. Monthly payments would be approximately $8,000, which is achievable based on conservative revenue projections from the property management business. Dad studied the financial projections with the intensity of a man trying to find flaws in a contract that might save his life. "What kind of property management? We don't have experience in that industry." "You'd be managing a portfolio of residential and commercial properties that Brooks Digital Solutions has been acquiring as investment assets. Rent collection, maintenance coordination, tenant relations, financial reporting. Nothing that requires specialized licensing or technical expertise." Mom looked up from the document with something that might have been hope. "And we'd be able to keep the house. The house would be transferred to Brooks Family Properties as the company headquarters and your primary residence."
As long as the company meets its financial obligations, you'd have secure housing and a steady income source. Tyler had been silent during the presentation, but now he leaned forward with the aggressive posture that usually preceded his most manipulative arguments. Where do I fit into this generous family business arrangement? You have two options, Tyler, I said, meeting his stare directly. Option 1 is that you declare personal bankruptcy, face whatever criminal charges the district attorney decides to pursue, and rebuild your life without any family support or financial assistance. And Option 2 is that you join Brooks Family Properties as a junior partner, work off your personal guarantees through sweat equity over 10 years, and submit to regular financial monitoring to ensure you're not creating new liabilities. Financial monitoring. Diana leaned forward, with the predatory smile she usually reserved for opposing counsel who had made tactical mistakes. Monthly financial disclosure, restricted access to credit, and mandatory participation in a certified gambling addiction treatment program. Any deviation from the agreed parameters would trigger immediate termination and reversion to Option 1. Tyler's jaw clenched as he processed the implications of what I was offering. It was salvation disguised as employment, redemption wrapped in accountability measures that would prevent him from repeating the destructive patterns that had created this crisis in the first place. You want me to work for you, Tyler said flatly. You want me to spend the next 10 years proving that I deserve your forgiveness. I want you to spend the next 10 years proving that you're capable of taking responsibility for your own life instead of expecting other people to clean up your messes. I replied, the choice is entirely yours. Mom reached across the table and touched Tyler's hand, her voice carrying the pleading tone that had enabled his behavior for decades. Tyler, honey, this is a second chance. Maybe we should consider it. A second chance. Tyler pulled his hand away from Mom's touch, his voice rising with indignation. This isn't a second chance, it's indentured servitude. She's buying us like property and pretending it's generosity. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for 30 years. Tyler's inability to accept responsibility, his talent for reframing every consequence as someone else's fault, his fundamental belief that the world owed him success without requiring effort or accountability. You're right, I said quietly. I am buying you. Just like you sold me when you convinced our parents to steal my inheritance to fund your gambling addiction. The difference is that I'm offering you a way to buy yourself back through honest work and demonstrated change. Tyler stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall. I don't have to listen to this self-righteous bullshit. You made your point, Natalie. You won. You proved that you're smarter and richer and more successful than the rest of us. Congratulations. Tyler, sit down. Dad's voice carried more authority than I'd heard from him in years. Your sister is offering us a way out of this situation that preserves our dignity and gives us a chance to rebuild. You need to seriously consider what she's proposing. What she's proposing is slavery with a salary. Tyler shot back. 10 years of being treated like a criminal on probation, having every financial decision monitored and approved by my little sister who thinks she's better than everyone else. I don't think I'm better than you, Tyler, I said, standing to face him across the table. I know I'm more responsible than you. I know I've made better decisions than you. And I know that I've earned the right to set conditions for my help instead of just handing you another blank check to gamble away. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Hartford traffic. 3 decades of family dysfunction had led to this moment, where the fundamental questions about accountability, responsibility, and love were finally being asked directly instead of dancing around them through passive-aggressive manipulation and enabling behavior. Tyler looked around the room at his parents, at the lawyers, at the documents that represented the complete collapse of the life he'd built on other people's money and other people's forgiveness. For a moment, I thought he might actually accept the reality of his situation and choose the difficult path of earning redemption through changed behavior. Instead, he grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and headed for the door. I'd rather be broke and homeless than spend 10 years being lectured by someone who abandoned her family the first chance she got. Tyler, wait. Mom called after him, but he was already gone, leaving behind only the echo of the door slamming and the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his life. Dad slumped in his chair like a man who had finally run out of excuses for his son's behavior. He'll come around. Once he's had time to think about it rationally, he'll realize that this is the best option available. No, he won't, I said gently.
Tyler will never accept help that requires him to acknowledge his own responsibility for creating this situation. He'd rather lose everything than admit that he made mistakes that had consequences. Mom was crying quietly, probably mourning not just Tyler's decision, but the recognition that her golden child was fundamentally incapable of the kind of growth that might have saved him. What happens now? Now you decide whether you want to accept the settlement offer for yourselves, regardless of Tyler's choice. Brooks Family Properties can operate successfully with just the two of you as managing partners. Diana consulted her notes and looked up at my parents. You have 48 hours to accept the settlement terms. After that, we'll proceed with foreclosure, and Tyler will face whatever criminal charges the district attorney decides to pursue. Dad reached across the table and took Mom's hand, a gesture of solidarity that I hadn't seen from them in years. We accept, he said firmly. We accept the settlement terms and will make Brooks Family Properties successful, even without Tyler's participation. Mom wiped her eyes and nodded. Especially without Tyler's participation. Maybe it's time we stopped enabling his self-destructive behavior and started focusing on building something positive. The legal paperwork took 3 hours to complete, with Diana explaining every clause and condition while my parents signed document after document transferring their old life into a new structure built on accountability and mutual respect. By evening, Robert and Linda Brooks had become managing partners in a property management company that would either save their financial future or provide a dignified framework for whatever years they had left. 6 months later, Brooks Family Properties had exceeded all revenue projections and was managing a portfolio of 37 residential and commercial properties across Connecticut and Massachusetts. My parents had discovered that they actually enjoyed the day-to-day challenges of property management and tenant relations, probably because it gave them a sense of purpose that had been missing from their lives for years. Tyler had declared bankruptcy and moved to Florida, where he was reportedly working as a restaurant server while living in a studio apartment. He'd made no attempt to contact the family since walking out of the settlement meeting, which was probably the healthiest decision he'd made in years. Marcus and I had successfully completed the Kellerman Industries contract after the negative publicity died down, and our handling of the family crisis actually enhanced our reputation for integrity and creative problem solving. Brooks Digital Solutions now employed 43 people across 3 offices and was being courted by acquisition firms who recognized the value of what we'd built. Most importantly, I had learned that justice didn't always require punishment, and that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal was creating an opportunity for redemption. My parents had stolen my inheritance, but in doing so they had forced me to discover capabilities and resources that were worth far more than any trust fund could ever have been. The money they'd taken was gone forever, but the lessons I'd learned about family, responsibility, and the true value of earned success had made me wealthier in ways that compound interest could never calculate. Sometimes the most expensive education is also the most valuable, especially when it teaches you that your worth isn't determined by what other people give you, but by what you build with your own hands and your own choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.